Hello. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Cynthia, for being here. I first read your writing as an 18-year-old when I moved to New York and was attending the alternative performances in theater that you had been chronicling doggedly in the Village Voice since the 1980s. And so I was also a huge fan of the artist and AIDS activist David Wojnarowicz, and when I heard that you were the person who had written a definitive and monumental biography of him, I was very excited and I devoured the book. And was totally taken aback by the level of detail in your research of his story. And he was someone very self-mythologizing, so I'm sure a mercurial subject, but also the level of detail about its related cultural histories of the East Village art scene, the AIDS crisis and its political movements, as well as the culture wars that ensued around that. So the same applies to the Candy Darling book, just a phenomenal amount of granular research in which Cynthia is able to create a completely immersive experience in a three-dimensional world. And I think that oftentimes when people are in conversation with those who might be called biographers, as I'm sure you are sometimes, the conversation is entirely about the subject of the work. And I would love to speak to you more about your process and your own artistry in terms of crafting those life stories. So, I think that you're going to read some excerpts that maybe you can set up, and then we'll have a conversation about the book.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm going to read two short parts, and they've both are focused on Candy's friend Jeremiah Newton. And Jeremiah is the person who talked me into writing this book, and he had been Candy's good friend. This is how they met. Jeremiah Newton met Candy in the summer of '66. He was about to start his last year of high school. He'd figured out that he was gay, but hadn't acted on it. One day, while reading a magazine he enjoyed called Vice Squad, he came upon a story headlined, "Boy Brothel Raided in Nefarious West Village." He decided then that he'd like to find this village. He took the subway from Queens to 42nd Street and stood there until he saw, quote, "this very swishy young boy about my age." Jeremiah followed him into the subway and got out where he did. He ended up on Greenwich Avenue, then the gay Mecca. He scrunched down in a doorway and watched as three women came walking down Greenwich, arm in arm like a small chorus line. Two of them were quite beautiful in black cocktail dresses and heels. The third he thought odd-looking, an albino in capri pants with blonde hair, hepatitis yellow and coarse as a Brillo pad. They said hello to him and walked by. A couple of minutes later, they were back, dropping a set of keys in his lap. "Ma'am, you dropped your keys," he said. One of the beauties, who turned out to be Candy Darling, replied, "It's time for the young man to join the ladies." As he walked arm in arm with Candy and Holly Woodlawn and the albino woman, Porky, down Greenwich to 8th Street and into the Marlton Hotel, then a cheap boho dive. Lenny Bruce had stayed there while on trial for obscenity, and Jack Kerouac wrote the Subterranean's Anne Tristessa in one of its shabby rooms. The proprietor, Molly Marlton, sat on a high chair near the elevator in what looked to Jeremiah like a batter's cage out of Coney Island. She had no legs and usually wore prosthesis, but it was a hot day. She'd taken them off. When she saw Jeremiah walk in with Candy and company, she started screaming, "You're not taking that kid upstairs with you, are you crazy?" Candy turned to her and said, "Why don't you get up and do something about it?" The four of them stepped into the elevator. Upstairs, they walked down a long hallway. Jeremiah remembered that all the doors seemed to be open and people were talking and flitting about. "We went into the last room where there was a big bed with a naked couple on it shooting up," he said, "shooting up heroin. I had never seen a naked woman before, let alone a naked man and a naked woman in bed. I was stunned." Candy and Holly walked back out, leaving Jeremiah there with Porky, who sidled up to him and said, "You know those two? They're not really women. They're guys. I'm a real woman." Jeremiah shrieked and ran back to the elevator. Downstairs, Molly Marlton was still strapping on her legs. And so now, of course, Jeremiah did become friends with Candy, though it happened gradually. He ran into her on the street another day and said to him, "I'd like to be your friend." And so she lived with him in 3 different apartments, of course, never paid any rent. Candy herself never had her own apartment. And after she died, she would keep going back once in a while to Massapequa Park, where her mother lived. Jeremiah got to know Candy's mother, Terry, after she died. And on the first visit, Terry was reluctant to let Jeremiah even hold the container that had Candy's ashes. And the part I'm going to read is about something that happened in 1982. Candy died in 1974. So now it's 1982, and Terry, the mother, invited Jeremiah to visit her. She was living upstate near Candy's half-brother, Warren. Candy and Warren had different fathers. So Jeremiah went up there not knowing why, and he brought a poster with the same picture that's on the cover of this book for a show that he'd curated, all about different photos of Candy taken by famous photographers. So, now we're upstate in 1982. Terry had remarried. She did not want to talk about Candy. She told Jeremiah that her new husband was out of town and that he hated homosexuals. Her grandchildren, Warren's children, would be at the house. She ordered Jeremiah not to speak to them. They had never been told about Candy's existence. Terry would not bring Jeremiah's poster into the house. She fixed him a meal and suggested they go to the movies. He declined, wondering again what he was doing there. The next day, in the last hour before his bus was to leave, Terry opened the cupboard doors of her hutch and announced, "Here are Candy's papers. Take whatever you want with you back to New York." Jeremiah hadn't brought more than a canvas carry-all with him. Terry found him a battered old suitcase and gave him some shopping bags, and he began pulling out journals and letters and photographs. He worried that Terry was going to tell him he couldn't have certain things, but then he noticed that she didn't even want to look at what he was doing. She only wondered why he hadn't brought anything to carry it in. "You didn't tell me you were going to give me things," he told her. "Oh, I didn't?" She urged him to hurry. There was only 1 bus a day. Jeremiah had about 20 minutes to stuff whatever he could carry into the bags. Terry promised that she would pack up the rest and ship it to him. Back at the 7-Eleven where the bus stopped, Jeremiah was about to board the bus when Terry shoved the tin holding Candy's ashes into his hands. She said she didn't know what to do with them. She explained again about the husband, his homophobia. "There's no place for Candy," said the mother. "She's better off with you." Sorry. I've actually never read this before, and now I know why. Within weeks, Terry had left New York State to join her husband in Florida. Jeremiah wrote to her, would she be sending him the rest of Candy's things? The mother wrote back to say that no, she wouldn't be. "It's been disposed of," she said. "I burned it." So, as it turned out, as I found out later, this was one of the first times I talked to Jeremiah. He told me that story. I found out later that actually she hadn't burned them. She'd given them to Warren, her other son. And eventually, with Jeremiah's help, he sent all of it to the Warhol Museum, where Jeremiah had also put quite a few of Candy's things. I think at that point the mother just didn't want to deal with it anymore. But that was so shocking to me when she's going, "I burned it." God. Anyway.
And I think that speaks to the precarity of archives and personal artifacts, particularly for generations of queer people whose families may have disowned them or not cared about what they had done. And in many respects, Jeremiah was chosen family to Candy and became the custodian of her artistic legacy, but it was his life's work. Can you tell us about your first encounter with Jeremiah and how you met him?
Yeah, there was this event on the Lower East Side set up by a guy named Clayton Patterson. He called them the Acker Awards, named after Kathy Acker. And I got one for my book about David Wojnarowicz, and Jeremiah got one for his film, he's in called called Beautiful Darling. It's a documentary, which is around. I think you can still see it online, and it's but he got an award for that. And the next day, he called me and he said, "I got your number from Clayton, and I don't know who you are, but I saw you on the stage, and I thought you're the person who has to write Candy's biography." So I wasn't sure if I should. I mean, I wasn't sure if that was the right thing for me, but I agreed to go over to his house, and he lived on Avenue C in the East Village. I'm between A and B, so I could walk right over. So he showed me that he had some of her journals and the stuff he'd gotten from her mother. I mean, it was there in a drawer. At least some of it was. There were journals and letters and some photos. And Candy's pictures are all over the internet, but he had some that I'd never seen before. So that was good. He also said that after Candy died, he wanted to write the biography. So he went around and interviewed people, and he would give me the tapes. So he did that. And, which although at that point we had to go, he had partial ownership of a house in Cherry Valley, New York. I think it's further upstate than this, I'm not sure. But that's where he had a house there, and that's where Candy is buried. Though I'll point out, Candy was not buried until 2007, after she died in 1974. And that's because he'd purchased a grave up there for his mother. So when the mother was buried, he buried Candy at the same time with her ashes. And last November, Jeremiah died, and he's now buried in that same grave, up in Cherry Valley. So the thing is, though, that Jeremiah, I should have known better. Maybe when I got to his house, and there was a path from the front door to a chair. Everything else was filled with boxes, and all kinds of his collections. Like he collected heads of Buddha, and those were all over the place, things like that. So he had those things that were in a drawer, but the rest of it was in some of these boxes. So I had to start going over there and going through boxes. I was also interviewing him. I never did the interviews and the searches of boxes on the same trip. I would do them at different times, but nothing was organized. I would go through these boxes, and they were filled with old tax returns and Christmas cards, and he did research on Isadora Duncan, so there'd be that, and there were letters from Herbert Huncke and all these other like old beatniks or people like that he knew, and it's a letter written by Candy. I mean, it was just all mushed together. So I had to go search for this stuff. He also told me right from the start that he had Candy's Mary Baker Eddy book, and most people, of course, never knew that she'd been interested in Christian Science, but she was, and that he had that book, and it was somewhere on one of his bookshelves. I had to recruit a guy from the neighborhood to come with me to Jeremiah's house to lift the boxes, because they were too big for me to lift. So then I could even see the bookshelves. But I never found it until Jeremiah went into the hospital, and he was there for a number of weeks in the hospital. Someone came in, because he was in such bad shape. Someone came in, and that's another long story, which is probably why she was there. But she put in a new floor and painted and took everything out into different storage spaces, and then started bringing it back. So then I was looking, and she's the one who finally found that Mary Baker Eddy book, and she almost threw it away, because she thought, Mary, who would want this? But then she paged through and saw it was full of underlines and things written in margins, all by Candy, So that was a close one. But that's how I finally got that. Anyway, sorry.
And I do think people with archive fever, like yourself, myself, it is a dream to find somebody who saved everything, and those things often find you after a while. So why you? Why did Jeremiah intuitively know that you were the one to do this, and why did you feel that you might be the one to do this project?
I don't know why he thought. I mean, it's just all I did at that ceremony was walk up on the steps, and the MC was drunk, and it was Lower East Side, so it was okay. But I don't think I even said very much, and maybe I held up a copy of the book or something so he could see. It's a substantial book, actually thicker than this one, but. what I thought about, what was that about why I thought?
Why you? Why would you be the one to write this?
Oh, well, when I went to his house and he showed me he had things, and I've written these 2 biographies, and I know for myself that I can't take on a project like that if I don't have journals and letters from the person to rely on. Working without that would be really hard for me, at least. So I saw that he had that, but what really got to me was the story that he told me about how, here's Candy in Manhattan, she knows all these famous people. She knows, Warhol and Salvador Dali and all, and she's going to all these glamorous parties, and she's acclaimed for her talent and her beauty. Then she goes home to Massapequa Park, and her mother is telling her, don't come home until it's dark. Don't let anyone see you. Don't answer the door. So I thought, okay, that's a story, the glamorous image, and then the reality of her life. I thought I'm interested in that. So that's why I decided I would do it.
And you must be cognizant that there is an expiration date for these projects, particularly subjects from the 60s and 70s, where many of the first-hand witnesses and storytellers are dying. When you discovered that Jeremiah had recorded copious interviews as well, was that a big draw for you as well?
Yeah, and those interviews were incredibly helpful. I feel like because almost everyone that he'd interviewed was dead by the time I started. There were just a couple who were still alive. And he interviewed her mother. He interviewed an important person in her life, Lorraine Newman, who was a beautician. And I think a kind of alternate mother because that's the first person that Candy spoke to about her gender dysphoria. She spoke to Lorraine, not her own mother. And because she knew Lorraine could hear her and was supportive of her. So Jeremiah had interviewed Lorraine and Lorraine's daughter who knew Candy. I mean, all these people who had known her, because Candy dropped out of school as soon as she could, and because she was tortured in school, as you can imagine, and never talked about her childhood, even with a friend like Jeremiah. She wouldn't tell him anything. So I had to pick up these, bits from other people about what had happened with her. Like there was some file, I think, maybe this was at the Warhol Museum. One of the playwrights who was at Cafe Chino got to know her. I think Gregory Rozakis, something like that. Anyway, he had written up a page of some memories, and in there was the detail that Candy would get on the school bus to go over to the high school, and the other kids would throw things at her. So I wouldn't have known that otherwise, and that was from that archive. But a lot of it came from these tapes too, that I transcribed all of them.
Tell us about the first time you listened to the tape of Terry, Candy's mother. What was that experience like?
Well, first of all, it was frustrating because she was in the middle of a story, and obviously the first tape had been lost, so I was getting the tail end of a story. But it was about her husband and how he, she divorced the guy named Jim Slattery, or John Slattery, but often was called Jim, and that she divorced him because he was doing something about. He was a drunk. He would come home drunk and he would beat them. And like the day that this happened, the end of the story was that Warren, the half-brother, was being dangled from a stairwell because he hadn't eaten all of his food, some ridiculous thing that a 5-year-old would do, but he was being punished in that way. And just all the stuff about, so that was like, it was sort of shocking to get that first look into what Terry had gone through. And, I have sort of mixed feelings about Candy's mother because in her own way, she tried to support Candy, even though she was afraid of being talked about in her conservative neighborhood, and that's when she was saying, well, don't let anyone see you, as if the other people didn't know. I mean, I'm sure they did, because Candy would run into them places like on the train, on the Long Island Railroad. And then there's the story of one who Candy said hello to this person and didn't recognize her because she was wearing a dress. and then thought later, oh, that was Jimmy, that was, and I didn't know people like that were allowed to be out, and things like that were coming up. I mean, there were a few little things like that gives you a hint of what the mother was dealing with, what kind of neighbors she had. So, it's...
And to give people a sense of the scope of research you do, no stone unturned, you did some 90-plus interviews of your own.
Yes.
How do you develop that web of contacts and sources, and are there anchor subjects within there that become major sources of intel?
Well, I heard some names from Jeremiah, and then other research I was doing, I would come across names. But one person who became very crucial to me was Augusto Machado, who he's in his 80s now, but he met Candy when she started hanging out with street queens, and he was a street queen at that point, hanging out on Christopher Street. And so Augusto talked about that, and about how even then Candy kind of stood out, like she was already like so beautiful and good looking that she was like the other street queens would ask her for advice and things like that, and he told me which stoop on Christopher Street she used to sit on. I can't remember the address, but it's in the book. And and then he told me the story later about going up to Bloomingdale. So Jackie Curtis, who the playwright, organized these trips up to Bloomingdale's on the one night that they were open late. He would take all the street queens would go up there into the furniture department, and they would develop these stories about, what if this was my room? Oh, let's say we're on Fire Island, and I've got this room. And Jackie would walk right in and sit down, and Candy started going too, but then she was more cautious, and so we're not supposed to walk into these things. And as Augusto pointed out to me, she had already seen better, because she was going to parties with Andy Warhol. And so, but Augusto was there, and then I won't reveal exactly what happens at the very end, but the street queens turn up again at the end. The street queens are very important to me, and all of that information came from Augusto.
And these are hidden histories. I mean, the only way that they could be gleaned is through the transmission of that knowledge through people like Augusto.
Yeah.
At the same time, you write in the book about how Jackie was kind of known to be a legendary liar. Do you really have to sometimes contend with the unreliability of your sources in these archives?
Well, yes. Jackie was one, and Jackie's a very important character also. Augusto appeared in a Jackie Curtis play called Vain Victory. That was his first, and Candy was in that, so I got a lot from Augusto about that play, because this went on through 3 different iterations and 3 different theaters. And but I do have these unreliable narrators, all of them so delightful, as I say, because it's true. But Holly Woodlawn was another one, and this guy named Paul Ambrose, who was in Vain Victory, and was a friend. Actually, he lived in this awful hotel called the Hotel Keller back in the 60s. It was, Augusto said, you'd take your life in your hands to go to the Hotel Keller. It was terrible, but he after that, he was basically kind of like Candy, dependent on the kindness of strangers, and was living with various people. When I met Paul, he died while I was still working on the book. I wish I could have, I talked to him 2 times. I wish I could have spoken to him more. But, there's a thing where with people, I did have to try to double check and go to other sources for certain stories. And as I think I point out in the book, for someone like, say, Holly, being accurate wasn't her job in the world. She was here for other reasons. And so, like, when she said that in one version of Vain Victory, there was a wheelchair, a mermaid in a wheelchair was in the second version. It didn't make it to the third version, but in her story, there's a wheelchair in the third version, and I think Holly is in it, and runs off the stage and lands in Candy's lap, because Candy came to see the play that she was no longer in. But as Augusto pointed out, well, when we left the WPA theater on the Bowery, we did leave the wheelchair out there for 5 minutes, and it was gone when we came back. So there never was a wheelchair in the third version, even though it's in Holly's story. But, it's a pretty good story anyway.
And, I mean, all of these anecdotes are so rich. The book is just so immersive and kaleidoscopic, but is part of your job as the researcher to build a timeline or chronology, and is that a kind of forensic exercise for you?
It's the thing I start with. I put down, I just make a file, a timeline. I put in the birth date, the death date, and then everything, as I go along, I fill in everything else that I can. And Candy, thank God she had journals, because she would say things in the journals that she never said to a friend, and and some of them, she did date them, but a lot of her journal entries were undated. And she did a lot of journal writing, but it was a little chaotic going with her chaotic life. She like at one point she was writing in a notebook she had used in her shop class in high school, because as a boy she had been forced to take shop. So she had drawings of things she was supposed to make in the class, but then she was filling it in later with other things from her later, real life. And then sometimes there would be just some cheap notebook she could buy for 10 cents, and she would have written stuff in there. But her friend George Abanialo gave her a diary at some point, and so she had 2 of these. They were like red journals that she would write in. But some of it was, I'm not sure she wrote the things that happened on the date that they really happened, but often she did. I mean, I had to, so there was some guesswork involved. Sometimes I had to go by context of like when would she have said something like this? And I think I figured out most of it.
Were there also cultural signifiers in the diaries that would have given clues about the date?
Well, yeah, or there were things about a movie that I could look up. When did this open? That I could go by, and yeah, but also the journals are important because she had a lot of despair in her life, but she never communicated that to people. And like that famous song about Candy, Candy says, "I've come to hate my body." I mean, her friend George, who really knew her pretty well, said she didn't hate her body, but it's there in the journal. There it is. "Despise my body" is what the exact words she's written in one of her journal entries.
And that sounds like that was the whole creative impetus for you, is to capture the kind of glamour of her public life as understood in the ephemera that's left behind versus the poignancy and suffering that she experienced as a trans woman of that generation.
Yeah, getting to the reality was really exactly what I wanted to do,
And
so
it sounds like reconstructing and sourcing these fragmented diaries was the foundation of your creative work. How were these diaries different than others you've handled or read before?
Well, just that they were a little more scattered with things that I couldn't find. I mean, David Wojnarowicz had journals, and was very conscious. There were almost always a date, and was very, he got into really writing down just about everything and lots of politics and all that kind of thing. Hers are usually shorter entries, and nothing political really, but but it's there. Where her despair about I wish I were dead and all that kind of stuff comes in, and but it doesn't. It usually doesn't go into a lot of self-reflection, But there is some, thank goodness,
And also, she was very apolitical, and I thought you did a great job kind of sketching out the kind of burgeoning politics around trans people in the kind of post-gay liberation era, and Candy was very much detached from that, and that felt evident through the diaries.
Right. And I mean, at that point, transgender people did not have a place in the gay movement. And the thing in the book is that it's kind of a cultural history that's like the beginning of Off Broadway, the beginnings of gay liberation, the beginnings of second wave feminism is all happening during Candy's life. So it's the start. Stonewall. She wouldn't go to the Stonewall because they wouldn't let her in. She didn't go to Julius because they threw her out for wearing a dress. And, you know, at Stonewall, she had at one point where they wouldn't let her in, and she said, well, you know, and she never came back. She didn't care about it. But, you know, the Stonewall riot happened and was, of course, crucial, but she never took any part in that. And then, you know, we have the infamous Sylvia Rivera incident where they tried to throw her off the stage and not let her talk. And it's like that happened maybe it was the second Gay Pride March, I'm not sure. First or second, it's in here. But, you know, there was just no place for transgender people. And the women's movement didn't want transgender women either. You know, I mean, so that took a long while to develop.
And I went to a talk that you gave with Lynn Tillman when the David Wojnarowicz book came out at SVA, and she made a point that really stuck with me, that in biography, for your work, these subjects are sort of vectors, she said, or she may have said prisms, but I remember her saying vectors, okay. In which, you know, a kind of, you know, whole ecosystem of cultural histories intersects through that one figure. Mm-hmm. And that seems very much the case in the story of Candy and how it's told by you. And I read in an interview that you are really interested in finding hinge moments in your subjects' lives. Can you talk about those hinge moments and how they relate to this cultural history?
Yeah, what I mean by that is a moment where you could have turned this way and done this, but instead you turned that way, and you know, and then that affects the rest of your path, you know. So with Candy, I think there were some crucial moments, like, you know, the people that she met, like meeting Jackie Curtis and meeting, you know, hanging out with the Street Queens. And Jackie Curtis really changed her life because she was interested in acting, but didn't think she could really do it. And he said, I'll write a play and you'll be in it. So, you know, I mean, I don't know that it would have happened otherwise. So, you know, meeting Jackie was crucial. And I think I found out when that really happened, although Jackie made up stories about it later. But it happened when Candy was already friends with Holly Woodlawn. They met on the street. And they were at someone's house on Bleecker Street watching Color Me Barbara, I think was the name of the Barbra Streisand special. They had gone there to watch it, and Jackie showed up too. So that's the first meeting with Candy and Jackie. And then they realized that they had all these things in common about loving movies. And, you know, I mean, there were movies that Candy knew, like she knew every line. You know, because it would come on to, in those days, there wasn't the wealth of programming we now have. So the $1 Million movie would come on, and then it would repeat 2 more times. So she'd watch all 3 of them, you know, and would get to know all the lines of certain favorite movies of hers. So, but anyway, she longed to do that, and Jackie made it possible for her, because that was the first play he wrote. It was called Glamour, Glory, and Gold. So,
and I feel like family is a major theme and thread in the book, whether it's her chosen family of Jeremiah, the best friend, or the often competitive sisterhood she has with Holly and Jackie, or obviously her fraught relationship with Terry. Can you talk more about the notion of family in this book?
Well, you know, she always did go back to her mother. For that part of the family. I mean, every maybe couple of weeks, she would go back and spend a couple of days in Massapequa Park inside, just hanging out. And her mother would always give her like $10 or maybe $20 if she had it. And, you know, so that was important for her. But I think with Jeremiah, she felt that she could always rely on him. He really was always willing to help her, you know, and so that was like, it was like having a brother, you know, that she could rely on. And, you know, even at the end when his last apartment was somewhere in the 80s, Upper West Side, and she couldn't walk up the steps anymore, so she couldn't stay there. She was too frail. But as a rule, he would say to her, you know, wherever I am, you can be. You can come in with me. So that was there was that family aspect. And, with people like Holly, they had, there's this mythology that Candy, Holly, and Jackie were these three. There's the famous Avedon picture of the three of them after they were in Women in Revolt. There was that picture. It appeared in Vogue, but I think in some ways she was closer to Jackie for quite a while, because they were always hatching different ideas about plays to do or things like that. And Holly was kind of jealous, I think, but also in the end, Holly came through as well. And, she went to see Holly when Holly started her cabaret career. Candy went, and Holly was shocked to see her there. And then Candy came backstage and said it was a wonderful show. And I can't believe she's saying it's a wonderful show. But it was true. Candy really felt it was a wonderful show. So they sort of, patched it up, which was good. And Holly was there at the funeral also. And so, they did have a certain closeness. And when they first met, Holly would come with her, was one of the people who would go out to Massapequa Park with her. And not too many people were ever allowed to come there with Candy. But they would go out there, and for one, they would sew things. They were sewing gowns, and they would watch movies. They'd be up all night and then sleep all day and things like that.
Slumber parties.
Yeah, just being girls together is what they said. So,
So throughout, it took you a decade to write the book.
yeah.
Tell me about how your relationship with Jeremiah evolved. And it's evident when you do readings and when you've talked about your work, both on David and Candy, that you're very emotionally involved in the material and these subjects you haven't met before. Did that relationship with Jeremiah deepen your emotional connection to Candy?
Yeah, I don't know if it was the relationship with him that did that. But he was always willing. He really wanted this book to happen. So, I called him, I'd have a little question about some detail. I'd call him up and ask him. And sometimes he wouldn't take people's calls because he was really sick. But he would always take my calls every time. And, would try his best to answer whatever I asked him. But I looked at my file the other day. The interviews with Jeremiah are 10,000 words longer than my entire book. So I talked to him a lot, and he was really totally my main source, and he was there for a lot of it. And, and he'd done his own amount of research because he was going to write the biography himself. So he was very helpful.
And in some ways, he almost chose you as a messenger for his own life's work, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you feel pressure with that expectation?
Well, I always feel pressure to do a good job on the book, not necessarily because of him, but because I feel like I've got to keep it it has to be at a certain level, or it can't go on. So,
Another thing I found interesting in the book was the relationship Candy had to gay men in the period, particularly Warhol, obviously Jeremiah, and this other figure, Sam Green, who was a curator come socialite who kind of ushered her through rarefied worlds. How would you describe that dynamic between Candy and these different gay men?
Well, she was totally dependent on gay men. For one thing, straight men or closet cases didn't want to be seen with her. It was just, they just didn't want to be seen with her, with the exception of Roger Vadim, who just didn't give a damn of, who he was seen with. But usually it was only gay men who would even take her to a show or a movie or something. It was always gay men. And with Warhol, this was interesting to me because he always referred to her as a drag queen. And that happened a lot, that people who knew her would refer to her as either a transvestite or a drag queen. And she wouldn't correct them, even though she hated that. She hated being called those things. But with Warhol especially, she wasn't going to say, I'm what would have then been called a transsexual. She never used that word herself that I could find in all her journals or letters or anything. She did not use the word transsexual. She would say, I'm a woman. But anyway, Warhol, it was interesting with him because, for one thing, he has such a reputation as a skinflint, but he actually gave her money at different points. Like he would take her to a concert, and then there was a thing in one of the unpublished diary pages, went with Candy, and she was wearing the dress looked terrible. I gave her $50. He would never do that with anyone else. And at one point, she came back from Germany, where she had made the Maria Malibran movie. And she had Deutschmarks and didn't know how to, and she said, it's going to cost me so much money to change can't you pay me dollars? And, so Warhol at that point, I think, gave her $100. And she had written some note of the total money she had, $101.30, something like, he would give her things, which was very unusual. And I asked Jeremiah about this at one point, and he said, well, Candy never asked him for money. So then he would, other people like Jackie Curtis would come over and give me money. Actually, I interviewed Jane Forth, who was a superstar, so-called, and she also worked at the factory as a receptionist. And I wanted to talk to her because she was in Women in Revolt. And she didn't even remember that. I got her on the phone. She said, I was in that? I don't remember. So, but somehow this theme of money came up. Or she talked about how she had worked there as a receptionist. She said, I could not believe how many people came in there to ask Andy for money. That had really stayed with her. Everybody wanted money from him. So he did give her money, and but he kind of loved Candy. There is the part where that comes from Bob Colacello is the source of this, who said that he found out Candy's diagnosis at the end of her life, and Bob Colacello said, for the first time in the however long I knew him, I saw Andy cry. Because he really cared about Candy. Then there were people like Flawless Sabrina, otherwise known as Jack Doroshaw. Flawless and Candy weren't really that close, but she was one of the people who took Candy to a doctor at the end when she knew it was time to go to a doctor. And then you have that dilemma then at least, as a trans person, who can I go to who isn't going to be hostile or demeaning to me, or who can I trust? I think that's a main reason she didn't go to get a diagnosis earlier, when it might have saved her life if she'd gone earlier. But Flawless took her to a doctor that he felt could be trusted on that score. So again, she went to people like that, and then she would have her moments of screaming at Jeremiah and calling him a faggot, which, but I think it was in her rage, it's like the worst thing she could think of to call him, because of course she was totally dependent on him. So
one question, just a more general question about the form in which you work. What do you think about the distinction between biographies and portraits? And would you be open to the idea that your book is a portrait of Candy instead of a biography?
That's fine, whatever you want to call it. It's, at one point, I was thinking, I never thought I would be a biographer. I really didn't. And I did the David book because in that case, it was his boyfriend who was begging me to please write the biography of David. And then I thought, okay, this is a way for me to talk about the East Village scene that I was part of, and to talk about the AIDS crisis and the culture war. And all these things mattered to me, and David is like a central part of this, so it makes sense for me to do this. It's a cultural history. And, with Candy, it was like the thing I had said before about her reality as a trans person back in the 60s and the 70s, but also all that cultural stuff around the beginnings of Off Broadway and, the other things that started, gay liberation, all that. To me, that's important.
So maybe
context.
You're a cultural historian who works in biography.
Right. And I don't know if I'll write another biography. I don't know that I will. They're actually not very easy to do. Not that I want something easy, but, this took me 10 years, and now I'm getting old. I don't know if I'm going to have another 10 years to work on it. So,
But I really am struck by the emotional involvement that you have in your work, which is just so evident when you've discussed it and also read from it. Do you feel like the success of your work is making those feelings about your subjects in those moments in time transferable to the reader? Is that one of your goals?
Oh, yeah, I hope so. I mean, there are parts of this book that I know I can't read in public because I'll start to cry. So I just hope that they're touching other people as well. But it's also been true, the first book I wrote was about a lynching that happened in my father's hometown, and I feel the same way about that book. That also took 10 years. But there are parts of that book that I absolutely can't read out loud. Because that was a long time ago. I mean, it was a relatively long time ago when I wrote that, but it's still very moving to me, and I'm very emotionally connected to these things, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that intensity comes across. It's part of why the books are so impactful. And on that note, we have time for some questions.